It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. On May 18, 2019, Mark and Sarah Peterson stood hand in hand in front of their family and friends, exchanging vows in a picturesque vineyard just outside of Seattle, Washington. The venue was adorned with delicate white roses, and the golden rays of the setting sun bathed the couple in a warm, ethereal glow. It was a scene straight out of a fairy tale. The person responsible for orchestrating this flawless event was Claire Lawson, a renowned wedding planner known for turning dreams into reality. Claire, in her early 40s, had built a reputation for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to create unforgettable experiences for her clients. From the perfect flower arrangements to the carefully curated music playlist, every element of the Peterson wedding had been planned to perfection. Mark and Sarah had met Claire 6 months prior when they were frantically searching for someone to bring their wedding vision to life. Mark, a successful architect, and Sarah, a marketing executive, had been too busy with their demanding careers to focus on the wedding details. Claire had been a godsend, taking over the planning with a calm, professional demeanor that put the couple at ease. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect event, something much darker was brewing. Claire and Mark had shared more than just ideas for the wedding. As the planning progressed, so did their secret relationship, one that would lead to tragic consequences. It all started innocently enough. During the early meetings, Mark was impressed by Claire's professionalism and her passion for her work. He found himself drawn to her confident demeanor and quick wit. For Claire, Mark represented everything she had been missing in her own life: stability, charm, and an appreciation for the finer things. Her marriage of 20 years had become stale, and the excitement of working closely with Mark rekindled a spark she hadn't felt in years. Their interactions, initially limited to wedding logistics, soon took on a more personal tone. They began meeting outside of the scheduled planning sessions, sharing coffee in cozy cafes, and exchanging texts late into the night. Mark found himself confiding in Claire about his doubts and fears regarding the marriage, something he hadn't even shared with Sarah. Claire, in turn, spoke of her unhappy marriage and how she felt trapped in a life that had lost its meaning. By March, just 2 months before the wedding, their relationship had crossed the line from emotional to physical. The secrecy and danger of their affair only fueled their passion. They met in hotels and out-of-the-way places where they were unlikely to be seen, always careful to cover their tracks. Mark knew what he was doing was wrong, but the allure of Claire was too powerful to resist. For Claire, what had started as a harmless flirtation had spiraled into something far more dangerous. She was falling in love with Mark, believing that he would leave Sarah for her once the wedding was over. She imagined a future together where they would be free to live out their passion openly, no longer bound by secrecy. But Mark never intended to leave Sarah. For him, the affair was a thrilling escape from the pressures of wedding planning and the impending commitment. He loved Sarah, or at least he believed he did, and he saw no reason why his affair with Claire should interfere with his marriage. After all, he reasoned, no one would ever find out. The wedding day came and went without a hitch. The guests praised the beauty and elegance of the ceremony, completely unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. As the newlyweds left for their honeymoon in Bali, Claire was left behind, her heart heavy with the realization that Mark was now a married man, and she was alone. Weeks passed, and Claire tried to move on, but the pain of losing Mark was too much to bear. She sent him messages, pleading for him to meet her, to explain what they had meant to each other. At first, Mark responded, gently trying to let her down, insisting that what they had was a fleeting moment and that they both needed to move on. But Claire refused to accept it. She couldn't understand how he could just walk away, as if their affair had been nothing more than a passing fancy. Desperation turned into obsession. Claire began showing up at places she knew Mark would be, always with an excuse for why she was there. She called him at odd hours, leaving messages that grew increasingly frantic and accusatory. She even drove by the Peterson home late at night, her mind racing with jealousy and anger. Mark, now fully aware of the depth of Claire's feelings, began to panic. He tried to distance himself, blocking her number and avoiding places they used to frequent. But Claire was relentless. She knew where he lived, where he worked, and she was not willing to let him go without a fight. Then, on the night of July 12th, everything changed. Sarah was out with friends, and Mark was alone at home, enjoying a rare evening of solitude. A knock on the door shattered the quiet. It was Claire, her face pale and eyes wild. She demanded to talk, to have an explanation for why he had abandoned her. When Mark tried to calm her down, things escalated quickly. Claire accused him of using her, of playing with her emotions, and then discarding her like she was nothing. What happened next would leave the quiet neighborhood of Bellevue in shock and disbelief. A love affair that was supposed to remain hidden was about to end in bloodshed, leaving two families torn apart and a once idyllic life shattered beyond repair. As Claire stood on the doorstep of the Peterson home, the evening air was thick with tension. Her eyes, usually calm and composed, were now wide and frantic. Mark knew this was a dangerous situation, but he couldn't just turn her away without making things worse. He reluctantly let her inside, hoping to avoid a scene that would alert the neighbors. Claire paced the living room, her hands trembling as she spoke in a rush. "How could you just leave me like that, Mark? You promised me, us, so much more. You said you were unhappy with Sarah, that I was the one who made you feel alive." Mark tried to keep his voice steady, struggling to find the right words to de-escalate the situation. "Claire, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. What we had, it was real, but it has to end. I'm married now. We both need to move on." But Claire wasn't listening. The words seemed to bounce off her as if they were meaningless. Her voice grew louder, accusations spilling out in a torrent of anger and heartbreak. "Move on? After everything we've been through, you expect me to just walk away?" Mark, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, took a step back. "Claire, please, you need to leave. We can't keep doing this." His words only seemed to fuel her rage. In one swift motion, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small kitchen knife, the blade glinting under the dim living room light. Mark froze, his eyes locked on the knife in her shaking hand. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, but the threat in her tone was clear. "You're not going to leave me, Mark. Not after what we had." Mark raised his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. "Claire, put the knife down. You don't want to do this." But Claire was beyond reasoning. All the hurt, the betrayal, the rejection had boiled over into a dangerous obsession. She took a step closer, and Mark could see the tears streaming down her face, her mascara smudged from the rain outside. He knew he had to stay calm, not make any sudden moves. "Why, Mark? Why did you lie to me?" she sobbed, the knife shaking in her hand. "You said you loved me." I did, Claire, but it's complicated. I love Sarah too. This isn't right. Please, just put the knife down and we can talk." But there was no reasoning with her. She lunged forward, slashing wildly. Mark managed to dodge the first swipe, stumbling backward into the coffee table, knocking over a vase that shattered on the floor. Panic gripped him as he tried to scramble away, but Claire was relentless, her fury driving her forward. The second slash caught him on the arm, a searing pain shooting through him as the blade cut into his flesh. Blood welled up from the wound, dripping onto the floor. Mark clutched his arm, his mind racing with fear and adrenaline. He had to get out, to get away from her, but she was blocking the only exit. "Claire, please," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't want to do this. Think about your family, your life." But Claire wasn't thinking rationally anymore. All she saw was the man who had promised her everything and then ripped it away. She saw the betrayal, the lies, the empty words. She raised the knife again, her eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. With no other choice, Mark lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with his uninjured hand, trying to wrestle the knife away. They struggled, each trying to overpower the other. The knife gleamed dangerously between them as they fought, their breaths ragged and strained. Then, in a sudden, horrible moment, the knife slipped from Claire's grasp. Time seemed to slow as the blade twisted in the air and plunged into her chest. A gasp escaped her lips, her eyes widening in shock as she stumbled backward, the knife embedded just below her collarbone. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Mark stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Claire's hand reached up to the hilt of the knife, her fingers trembling as she looked at him, her expression a mix of pain and disbelief. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to." Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the floor, the life draining from her eyes as blood pooled around her. Mark rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding, but it was useless. The wound was fatal, and within moments, Claire Lawson was dead. Mark staggered back, his mind reeling. What had he done? He looked down at his hands, covered in her blood, and a wave of nausea washed over him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. Panic set in as he realized the gravity of the situation. Claire was dead, and he was the only one there. What would the police think? He had to think fast, to do something, anything, to get out of this nightmare. He stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. He couldn't stay there. He had to leave, to get away from the horror of what he had done. But as he reached for his phone to call for help, he realized something else. He couldn't just run. If he did, he'd be a fugitive, a murderer in the eyes of the law. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke into the phone, his words a desperate plea. "There's been an accident. I think I've killed someone." Mark's call to 911 set off a chain of events that would forever change his life. The dispatcher kept him on the line, urging him to remain calm as he stumbled through his explanation. "It was an accident," he kept repeating, his voice shaking. "She had a knife. I didn't mean to." Within minutes, sirens blared through the quiet neighborhood. The police arrived first, followed by paramedics who quickly assessed Claire's lifeless body. The living room, once pristine and elegant, was now a scene of chaos and blood. Mark sat on the couch, his hands still trembling, the shock numbing his mind to the reality around him. Detective Laura Bennett, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, took charge. She immediately noticed the signs of struggle: the broken vase, the blood smeared on the coffee table, the knife protruding from Claire's chest. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, piecing together what had happened. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened here tonight." Mark, his face pale and drenched in sweat, recounted the events as best he could. He explained how Claire had shown up unannounced, how she had been upset, and how she had pulled the knife on him. He described the struggle, the accidental stabbing, the horror of watching her collapse to the floor. Bennett listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Mark finished, she nodded, glancing over at the forensic team already documenting the scene. "We'll need to take you in for questioning, Mr. Peterson. Please cooperate, and we'll sort this out." Mark was handcuffed and led to the patrol car, his mind spinning with the impossibility of what had happened. As he sat in the back seat, he realized the full gravity of his situation. Claire was dead, and there was no undoing that. No explanation would bring her back or erase what he had done. At the station, the interrogation room was cold and sterile. Mark sat across from Detective Bennett, his hands still trembling as she pressed him for details. He tried to explain again, to make her see that it was an accident, that he had no intention of killing Claire. But Bennett's questions were sharp, probing for inconsistencies. "Why didn't you call the police sooner, Mark? Why let her into your home if you knew she was unstable?" she asked, her eyes fixed on him. Mark struggled to answer, his mind clouded with fear and regret. I thought I could calm her down. I didn't want to make things worse." Bennett leaned back, her gaze never leaving his. "And yet, she ended up dead. A knife wound like that, Mark. It's hard to believe it was just an accident." Hours passed, the relentless questioning breaking down Mark's fragile composure. By the time they finished, he was a shell of himself, exhausted and defeated. He was released on bail the next day, but the damage was done. The media had already gotten wind of the story. Successful architect embroiled in a deadly affair with his wedding planner. The headlines were brutal, his face plastered across every screen. The trial was swift and unforgiving. The prosecution painted Mark as a cold, calculating man who had used Claire and then discarded her, only to silence her permanently when she threatened to expose their affair. They argued that the struggle was a lie, that he had stabbed her in a fit of rage. Mark's defense tried tried to portray him as a victim of circumstance, a man caught in an impossible situation who had made a tragic mistake. But the evidence was damning. The forensics showed that the angle of the stab wound was inconsistent with his story of a struggle. The texts between Mark and Claire, retrieved from their phones, painted a picture of a volatile relationship spiraling out of control. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Mark was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. As he was led away in handcuffs, he caught a glimpse of Sarah in the gallery, her face a mask of pain and disbelief. He had destroyed everything: his marriage, his life, and most tragically, Claire's life. As the doors closed behind him, Mark realized that he would spend the rest of his life haunted by that night, by the choices he had made, and by the memory of Claire's face, frozen in shock and betrayal. It was a story that should have ended with a beautiful wedding, but instead, it had become a nightmare of guilt, regret, and loss.